Today we're going to talk about the Great Depression, particularly the causes of the Great Depression. So our goal is to list and explain the 5 causes of the Great Depression. So before we get to actually describing, let's set the scene. So first of all, we're in the 1920s. We're just after World War I had gotten over. And let's say a farmer buys a car. If a farmer buys a car, that's good because that means that he is spending money. And if he is spending money, that means that auto workers now have money. And if auto workers have money, they can then use that money to buy TVs, or at the time maybe more likely radios, which means that would create even more jobs. And so those people who make TVs or radios, now they can go out and they can buy computers, maybe an Abacus at the time, but they could go buy computers and that would create more jobs. So now the computer factory workers have money and they can use that money to buy video games, and the video game workers can then use that money and buy more stuff. This is a principle called trickle-down economics. The idea being that if you give somebody some money at the top, they're going to spend the money and it's going to trickle down through the economy. By one person spending money, it's going to create more jobs for everybody else. And this is the predominant economic theory at the time. So in essence, this is a good thing until we get to the domino effect. So the other side of it is if a guy gets fired, that means he's not spending money on goods. And if he is not spending money on goods, that means the company that makes those goods, they're going to fail and they're going to go out of business, which means those workers are going to get fired, which means those workers are then going to, that company is then going to fail, and then another man's going to get fired and the circular effect happens. So while this trickle-down effect can be a good thing, it can also be a bad thing. We can see the domino effect where people getting laid off are going to lose money. And that's essentially what's going to happen during the Great Depression. One person loses a job, that's a bad thing, but that means they're not spending money in the economy, which means other markets are going to fail. And if those markets fail, that means even more markets are going to fail. And pretty soon we're going to have a really bad situation all around. So essentially, if an industrial worker gets higher wages, the price of manufactured goods is going to go up. And if the price of manufactured goods goes up, the number of consumers, the number of people buying those goods is going to go, you guessed it, down. And if people are buying less stuff, the number of store owners is going to go, you guessed it, down. And if store owners go down, if store owners are not buying stuff, what's going to happen to the number of factories? Yep, that's right, it's going to go down. And if the number of factory workers goes down, we're not going to need as many workers, and then that means other factories are going to go out of business as well. And so this is the circular effect of the economy. This is the trickle-down effect. Trickle-down effect can be good when it comes to creating jobs, but it can also be bad because if one person or one industry loses their jobs, it's not just that industry that suffers, it affects the entire American economy. So I want you to describe the economy after World War I. What's the American economy look like? And tell me why you chose this description. All right, well, if you said that the 1920s economy was booming, hence the nickname the Roaring Twenties, you are correct. Things are good because World War I is over. And during World War I, we had to increase production. We had to make all this stuff. We wanted to not only create weapons, but we had to feed people in Europe. So that meant that our farmers were doing well. Pretty much production was up during World War I. However, do we need all these factories after the war is over? No. We don't need as many war goods, so those people are going to lose their jobs. And on top of that, we don't need as many farmers. During the war, we were trying to feed not just the American military, but we were trying to feed France and Great Britain and everybody else on our side. But now the war is over and we don't have to feed all those people. France is feeding themselves, Great Britain is feeding themselves. And so our farmers are going to take a major hit. A lot of times we get this nickname, the Roaring Twenties, and we think that everything is going grand in the 1920s. We think of the extravagance of the 1920s, but it's not that way for everybody, especially towards the end of the 1920s. By the end of the 1920s, everybody has developed this idea of consumerism, this idea of a spending mentality, the idea that we have to buy more and more things, buy these new manufactured goods that are being produced in the factories, get the newest, latest and greatest in clothing, get the latest craze of everything, which, yes, things were better than during the war, and certainly many people had a lot more money than they had before, But that also means people want to buy stuff. They want to buy more things than they have. And, well, if you don't have enough money to buy and live the extravagant lifestyle, you do what you can. You take out credit. You borrow money. And one of the problems is more and more people are borrowing money. Borrowing on credit means that you buy now, you pay later. But of course, you're going to have to pay it back with interest. Now, this is okay as long as you can afford to pay it back. But as more and more people are using credit, eventually they get into so much debt that they can't afford to pay it back. And when people start to get too much debt, they stop spending money. They realize, I can't even pay back the money that I've already borrowed, so I'm not going to spend any more money. And when the spending stops, that whole trickle-down effect that we saw is going to take place. When it comes to the causes of the Great Depression, historians will throw all these things out there: higher tariffs and war debt, stock market crash, farming crisis, industry, agriculture, overproduction, 1928 presidential election, unequal distribution of wealth, and monetary policy. So some historians would say that these are all causes of the Great Depression. Some historians will shrink it down and say basically there were three causes of the Great Depression. Number one, high rates of unemployment, especially towards the end of the 1920s. Number two, overproduction of agriculture and of industrial products. And number three, high inflation. And these are all things we start to see by the end of the 1920s, and they are all things that will contribute to the Great Depression. We're going to look at in class, though, we're going to call 5 different causes of the Great Depression. So cause number one is overproduction of agriculture and really anything. So during the war, production is up. Farmers need to produce a whole lot of things. They need to produce not only for America, but they need to produce for France and Great Britain. So they take out a bunch of loans in order to grow crops so that they can feed other countries. This is all really good. This is all really great, except eventually they have to pay back those loans. And after the war, they've got a whole lot more excess crops than they needed. So farmers who readjusted their growing schedule, it helped them out during the war, but now the war is over and they're still growing the same amount of things. They can't make that stuff go away. So let's say that during the war, you could sell 10 apples for $20. Now all of a sudden, you are still growing more and more apples than you ever need. You're still growing 10 apples. So what's going to happen to the price of apples? That's right, the price of apples is going to go down. And if the supply is high, then that means the cost of the product, the value of the product is going to go down. The price is going to be lower. So now farmers have to lower their prices. Now maybe 10 apples will only fetch $10 because they've produced so many of the goods, they've produced so many apples, they don't even know what to do anymore. So what do farmers have to do in order to make up their money? Well, you guessed it, they need to grow more crops. So even though sales are increasing, the profits they're making are going down. So what farmers have to do, they can't raise their prices. If they raise their prices, nobody's going to buy their stuff. They have to keep lowering their prices to meet the consumer demand. So farmers just figure, well, we'll just grow more crops. So if we just double the amount of crops that we're growing, if we grow 20 apples instead of 10, we can still break even. We can still make our $20. Now, this is a really good idea from the farmer's point of view, but farmers didn't understand basic economics. Because as they started to grow more crops, what happens to the value of those crops? You guessed it, they had to take out more loans in order to pay for those crops, and the profits went down even more. So not only is their cost of production going up, but their profits are going down. So farmers are losing more and more each time they grow. If we start to look at the wholesale price of some selected commodities, 1925, a bushel of wheat cost $1.67. By 1931, that was down to 60 cents. Or a pound of wool in 1925 was $1.40. That number drops almost in half by 1931 at 62 cents, more than half. And so you can see the cost of goods, the value of goods, the profit that farmers were making went down significantly in the later part of the 1920s and into the 1930s. So now farmers have less money. What does that mean? You guessed it, it means that farmers can buy less consumer goods. It means they can buy less TVs or radios or vacuum cleaners or refrigerators or Model Ts or whatever it is that they were buying. And if they buy less, what does that mean? Well, if they're buying less consumer goods, they're buying less houses, they're buying less furniture, they're buying less clothing, they're buying less entertainment, they're buying less of all this stuff. And if they're buying less of all this stuff, then that means those industries are going to get hit. And if those industries get hit, that means that everybody who works in those industries, they're going to buy less stuff as well. And so what we start to see is the number of businesses that fail goes up significantly. From 1929 into 30, 31, and into 32, the number of businesses in thousands that fail almost doubles. And so we see huge numbers of business failures. Cause number 2, the distribution of wealth in America. One of the things that we see after the war is the gap between the rich and the poor is continuing to grow. From 1920 to 1929, the top 1% of Americans accounted for 75% of the economy. The average amount of Americans accounted for about 9% of the overall income in America. And so what we see is this gap between the rich and the poor, the gap between the haves and the have-nots, it is continuing to grow. The rich keep getting richer and the poor getting poorer. And so this is one of the problems that we're going to have is as the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, that means the poor are buying less things. For example, the living wage at the time was about $2,500 a year. That's about $29,000 in today's money. And 70% of families earned less than that. Some other things, and you won't need to memorize all the details, but just to give you an idea of how poor 70% of Americans were, most people did not have lighting and furnace in their homes. Only about half of the homes in America had lighting and furnaces. The average number of new outfits per year that a person would buy, yep, you guessed it, about 1 per year. And so the result is these people aren't buying stuff because they don't have money to buy stuff with. And if they can't buy stuff, that means that those industries are going to fail, and any industry connected to those industries is going to fail. The average yearly income per person from 1929 to 1933 will go down significantly, will almost drop in half, as will the average amount of consumer spending. As people have less money, they spend less money, and if they spend less money, that means more and more people are going to be out of a job. The third cause of the Great Depression is speculation, or what we would sometimes call the stock market crash. Speculation is what causes the stock market crash. So first of all, let's look at a basic overview of how a stock works. So let's say General Motors is our entire pie here. The way a stock works is when you buy a stock, technically speaking, you are buying a portion of that company. So we've got one giant company. If you buy a stock, you buy a share, which means you technically own a little teeny tiny bit of the company. Now, at a company like GM, if you buy a share of GM, you own a teeny tiny little bit, but every share that you have of a company means that you own some of that company. So if I buy a share, or if I buy 2 shares or 3 shares, or we add all these shares together, essentially we will figure out who owns the company. So what people would do is they would buy on speculation. Speculation is a fancy way of basically saying they gambled. They took a risk. Yes, people wanted to be rich, and in order to be rich, they would try to buy parts of a company. They would buy a stock, and they would sell it. They would try to sell in order to make money off of that. So if I own a portion of GM, that means I get some of the profits from GM. But if I sell my ownership in GM, maybe I can make even more money. Speculation is when you buy something with the expectation of selling it. And hopefully you sell it for more money than you paid for it, and if you do, you make money. And what was happening in the 1900s, what was happening in the 1920s, is that a lot of people were buying stock on speculation. They were buying in the hopes of making a profit. But the thing is, when you buy on speculation, you usually don't have enough money to buy the full stock on your own. So what you would do is you would pay a small percentage of the stock, and you would take out a loan, you would borrow the rest of the money. So even if you can afford to buy a full stock, you could take out a loan, and then when you resell your stock, you would pay off the loan, and hopefully you would make a profit. And in the early part of the 20s, a lot of people were buying on speculation. They were buying stocks, they were buying shares, parts of a company, and then they were selling them and making huge profits. So it looks something like this. Let's say that we wanted to buy a $1,000 stock. Maybe we would put $100 down and we would borrow $900 for it. And in a perfect world, and what was happening at the beginning of the 20s is we would sell this for a profit. So we would pay $100, we would borrow $900, and then we would turn around and sell for a profit. So if we were able to sell that for $1,500, then we are going to be able to pay back the $900 that we borrowed. We'll get our original $100 back, and we make a $500 profit. This, of course, is good if you can buy on speculation and make a profit. Unfortunately, if you sell the stock for less money than you paid for it, that means that you're going to be out of money, as will the other guy. And so let's say that we're only able to sell that stock for $500. Maybe you get your original $100 back, but remember, you borrowed $900 in order to buy that, which means you are going to lose a total of $500. So yes, you get some money back, but if you sell for a loss, this is a really, really bad situation. This means you are going to lose money. It basically is like gambling with stocks. So by 1929, over 4 million Americans own stock, which is only about 3% of the overall population. It doesn't seem like a whole lot, but when you consider 4 million Americans, that's still a lot of people owning stock. When 3% of the population owns stock, this is going to make an impact on the economy. In September of 1929, things were going good. The stocks were peaking. Everybody who was investing was making money. The speculators were making money. The banks were making money, loaning money to people. Everybody was making money. And then confidence started to waver. People started to become skeptical. Combined with some of the other things that were going on in the economy, the other 4 factors that led to the Great Depression, people start to panic. And when they start to panic, when they start to lose a little bit of money, they say, I want to sell all my stocks before I lose even more money. But as more and more people sell stocks, this creates a panic and more people will sell their stocks, and then the value of stocks will go down. And then more people will sell their stocks until we get what is called Black Tuesday. We get the stock market crash. It is one of the darkest days in American history because the stock market crashes. Everybody's so quick to try to sell off what they've got, they end up losing billions of dollars. So we can see that the stock market, up until October 28, 1929, where the stock market peaks, stocks are going up in value, people are doing well, and then it crashes, and then it goes down. October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday, becomes one of the darkest days in American history as people lose millions, if not billions of dollars. Stock market then goes up a little bit after that, but then people start to panic even more, and the stock market goes down more and more and more, and then eventually, October 29th, 1929, the stock market crashes. On this particular day, 16.4 million people sold their shares. Other people wanted to sell their shares, but they couldn't even find anybody to buy it. By mid-November of 1929, investors had lost over $30 billion. Keep in mind, this is about what World War I cost. We know World War I cost a little bit more than that. But by 1929, investors had lost over $30 billion. And if people lose $30 billion, this is $30 billion that they are not spending in the economy. The stock market crash does terrible things. We see the rise in the stock market in the roaring 20s, but we hit the end of the 20s, Black Tuesday, stock market goes down. It goes up a little bit, and then it continues to go down until it hits rock bottom. Cause number 4 of the Great Depression, the financial collapse. So in order to understand why the banks crash, we first have to understand how a bank works. And so we're going to simplify things. Basically, the way a bank works is little Johnny takes $100. He puts it into the bank. The bank is not going to keep all of little Johnny's money. The bank is going to loan out some of that money. So the bank takes little Johnny's money and they loan it to Susie. So now the money supply is not just little Johnny's $100, but they've loaned out $50 to Susie. So now we've got $50 worth of money. Susie's going to go out, she's going to spend the money, and then the store that she spends the money at is eventually going to put that money into the bank. the bank is going to have some money, and then they're going to lend $25 out to little Billy. And so altogether from this $100 bill that Johnny had, we're going to create over $175 in economic growth. And all is good. Banks take in money, they lend out to other people, and then the other people will eventually pay them back, and they will pay back little Johnny with interest. This is the way a bank works. And all is good as long as everybody is willing to pay back their money. However, when the stock market is crashing, so too are banks. A lot of people, they start to lose confidence in the banks. And when they lose confidence in the banks, they go to the banks and they ask for their money back. Now, if only one person asks for their money back, it's not a big deal. If little Johnny wants his $100 back, the bank should be able to give him his $100 back. But if every single person who put money into the banks wants their money back, and they want it back at the exact same time, banks simply put don't have enough money to give money back. Because, as we saw, the bank had already lent out some of that money to Susie and some of that money to Billy, and as the banks have lent out all this money, if Johnny wants his $100 back and he's the only one who loaned money to the banks, if there's no other money in the bank, then Johnny's not going to be able to get his money back until Billy and Susie pay the bank back. Well, Billy and Susie can't afford to pay the bank back, and now Johnny's out money. So when everybody starts asking for their money at once, this is called a run on the bank. See, the problem is when banks can't keep up with the demand of people who want their money back, banks start to run out of money, and eventually a bank will go bankrupt. Another problem that we have is banks invested in the stock market. You can't do that anymore. It's illegal today, but back in those days, the bank used to buy stocks, and, well, all was good until the stock market crashed. When the stock market crashed, banks lost money. Banks could not keep up with giving money back to the people, which causes more and more lack of confidence in banks. And when that lack of confidence in banks kicks in, things just get worse. If any of you have ever seen the movie It's a Wonderful Life, it's a really good movie. And so this clip from A Wonderful Life is going to explain what happens to your money when you put it into a bank, and then also how a bank run works.
Just remember that this thing isn't as black as it appeared. I have some news for you, folks. I was just talking to old man Potter, and he's guaranteed cash payments to the bank. The bank's going to reopen next week.
But, George, I got my money here. Did he guarantee this place?
Well, no, Charlie, I didn't even ask him. We don't need Potter over here.
And I'll take mine now.
No, but you're thinking of this place all wrong, as if I had the money back in a safe. The money's not here. Well, your money's in Joe's house. That's right next to yours. And in the Kennedy house, and Mrs. Maitland's house, and 100 others. You're lending them the money to build, and then they're going to pay it back to you as best they can. Now, what are you going to do, foreclose on them?
I got $242 in here, and $242 isn't going to break anybody.
Okay, Tom. All right. Here you are. You sign this. You get your money in 60 days.
60 days?
So that's how a bank run works. One of the things that we see during the 1920s is that a lot of banks will fail. Yes, in 1929, it was closing time. In fact, over 600 banks failed. Now, 600 doesn't sound like a huge number, but given that there were only about 25,000 total banks in the United States, 600 failing is a big deal. Get to 1933, and it is even worse. By 1933, over 11,000 banks had failed. That's almost half of all the banks in America would go under. Almost half of the banks failed. And with this went the people's money. Remember, it's not just that banks are closing, but people had their money in banks. Bank failures would go up significantly from 1932 to 1933. Eventually, we've got thousands and thousands and thousands of banks that would fail. The result is, of course, that all these people who had their money in the banks, they would lose their savings. Not only were the banks closed, but businesses would go bankrupt as well. Because now, people can't afford to be in business. They're losing money left and right. Over 90,000 businesses went bankrupt. And if those businesses close, what happens to the production of goods? That's right, it goes down, which means employment rates, they too go down. And so one of the biggest things that we see as a result of the bank collapse and all these other factors is that the unemployment rate reaches a record high. The unemployment rate in 1933 was about 25%. And so the record high unemployment rate went from not too much in 1929, 1.6 million or 3%, which is considered normal, to over 25%, over 25 million people without a job in 1933. And so that is a number you will need to know. 25% of the public was unemployed in 1933. To make matters worse, that's the people who are unemployed, the people who flat out don't have a job. That doesn't even account for the people who have jobs, but just jobs that don't pay enough money. Other people had their pay reduced or their hours reduced, so they weren't making the money that they could make before. So it's even worse than the 25% number. Probably somewhere between 50 to 75% of Americans are affected by the bank collapse. Cause number 5 of the Great Depression is what is known as protectionism or tariffs. So one of the things that we have to look at is, how do countries get money? If I'm Germany or the United States or England, how do I get money? You guessed it, by trade. Germany gets money by selling things to the United States. United States gets money by selling things to Germany. Same thing with England. We all get money by selling stuff to each other. Now, of course, after the war was over, Germany has a little bit of a problem. Germany has to pay war reparations to France and Great Britain, which means that Germany is not going to have much money. They're not going to have enough money to go out and buy American goods. And this is going to lead to some Americans losing their jobs. To make matters worse, America responds by trying to protect American jobs with a policy known as protectionism. Basically, protectionism is going back to the days of isolationism. And so we've already learned about before the Hawley-Smoot tariff in 1930. This was the highest tariff in American history. This was about a 90% tariff. So if anybody, whether it's France, Great Britain, Germany, it doesn't matter. If you are a country and you wanted to sell something to the United States, you would have to pay this huge tariff. Now, this is good because it encourages Americans to buy American-made stuff, but it's also bad because now the people who live in those countries aren't making money. And if they're not making money by selling stuff to the United States, that means they also don't have enough money to buy goods from the United States. So if France and Great Britain can't buy stuff from the United States, that means they're losing out on money. In addition, these countries would also retaliate. They would put high tariffs and high taxes on the stuff that they were selling. And so now Americans can afford to buy stuff from them as well, which means altogether trade is going to go down. And as you'll learn in economics class next year, when trade goes down, everybody loses. One of the problems is because we are no longer trading with other countries, because we're trying to be isolationist, we're trying to protect American jobs, but we're actually hurting them. With these high tariffs, people can't afford to buy American goods. And because people can't afford to buy American goods, that means that American factories don't need to make as many goods. And that means they lay off their employees, and unemployment is going to continue to rise. So again, we see this domino effect taking place. A man gets fired, he doesn't have money to buy stuff, which means those companies go out of business, which means they have to fire their employees, which means they don't have money to buy stuff, which means that company fails and more people lose their jobs. The overall consequences is that we have the Great Depression. Did any one of these things cause the Great Depression in and of itself? No, absolutely not. It is a combination of the factors put together that are going to lead us to the Great Depression. And so if we look at war debt after the war, that is going to lead to Great Depression. That's all for today. Have a wonderful evening.